Today will be a little bit of a shorter sermon, but I'm excited to dive in with you guys to 1 Peter 4 today. So we're continuing our sermon series, basically just reading people's mail. That's essentially what a lot of the New Testament is reading the mail between, this time it's Peter and these people in present-day Turkey, which is kind of this like area of Asia Minor that was controlled by the Romans and was a just very different culture than a lot of the rest of what we see the culture in the New Testament. So last week we talked about what it would look like if we showed the heart of God by being like-minded, sympathetic, loving towards one another, compassionate and humble, and we repaid good for evil and responded with gentleness and respect. So last week's section was like the here's what you should do section. Like this is the what to do. This week is the what not to do section. So it's a whole lot more racy. It's a little different than a lot of the rest of the New Testament because Peter just like lays it out there, which is a very Peter thing to do. So he just tells us like what sin we should stay away from in our lives and what we need to avoid, but also like why, like what's the reason behind all this stuff going on. So we're going to dig in here to 1 Peter 4, 1 and 2. So follow along on the screen here, or you can look through the sermon notes if you want to download the Living Faith app, or you can just use a Bible. 1 Peter 4, 1 through 2. So therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. So right off the bat in this section, he just like goes for it, right? Like suffer and like it. Like that's essentially what he's saying here. It really is. So these two verses here are so completely counterculture to how we live our lives, right? Like everything in like present modern day 2020s America is like the goal of everything is happiness, right? Like the world would tell you like, why would you have this job if it doesn't make you happy? Why would you do this thing if it doesn't make you happy? Why would you invest in your family if it doesn't make you happy? Just leave all those things if you don't like them, right? Everything's about happiness and like what you feel inside. And if anything is even remotely uncomfortable, you fix it or you walk away from it, right? Like, there's a reason that our divorce rate is so high in this country, because we're told if you stop liking that person, you just leave. That's it. That's why our fatherlessness, like, epidemic is such a huge thing right now, because people are like, oh, you don't like having kids? Great, don't. Abortion, same thing. You don't want a kid? Great, don't. You know, like, there's so many things in our culture today where we just completely go towards comfort. And the idea of suffering is completely like unacceptable. And even just like when we read this word suffering in this verse, we look at that as a complete negative no matter what period all the time, right? Like the idea of suffering feels like almost equal to sin for us. Like just suffering in general is something that we so want to stay away from. But what Peter's saying is embrace the suffering. Like he's saying, like, suffer, do it, like feel this thing. In the same way that Christ suffered in his body, you should suffer in yours. He says, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. So what do you guys think it means when it says, like, whoever suffers in the body? Like how do you think that Christ suffered? Shout it out. Yeah, the obvious one is actually right. Yeah, like what? Yeah, physical pain, the cross, absolutely, right? Like it's not a trick question. I like to do trick questions. This is not. Yeah, Jesus suffered because he literally died on the cross. But I don't think that's actually like the context of what Peter's talking about here. I think he's talking about like just the suffering of Jesus being in his body. Like, have you ever thought about what that would be like? You know, like for Jesus, who is God, who has been forever, you know, like there is no beginning to Jesus. He just always has been, which is crazy in and of itself. But he's always been in heaven where there's like no pain and no suffering, right? And then he got put in a body. Now, who here has never had any pain in their body? Yeah, okay. Like, right? Like, exactly. I mean, a lot of us in this room are different ages and have different levels of pain that we felt or feel at all times. But man, like, your body just hurts, like sometimes like bodies just don't feel good. And imagine Jesus being up in heaven in the BC days, and he's got no problems, no issues, everything's just good, and like there's no like toil, like there's no like stress in working, there's no like having to catch your breath, there's no temptation. Like there's all these things like where those things, we look at heaven like it's one day those things will go away. But for Jesus, he looked at it as one day those are things I'm going to have to accept and embrace. Think about that. Like Jesus just coming, just being stuck in the third dimensional form of our bodies sucked. Like it was just the worst to have to go through that. And I think I think that's partially at least what Peter's getting at here for us, is that like we need to embrace that suffering so that we can deny our flesh and choose what God has for us, right? Have you guys ever heard the phrase embrace the suck? Yeah? So if you haven't, embrace the suck is a military term, specifically started in the Navy. So Navy SEALs have to go through... That's funny. Navy SEALs have to go through this intense 56-week training to become a Navy SEAL, like just their like first training, and then they keep getting trained after that. And in that 56 weeks, there's a 5.5-day thing called Hell Week. Have you guys ever heard about Navy SEALs Hell Week? It's hell. Like it's the absolute worst. I don't know why John's smiling so big, but yes. It is the absolute worst thing that you can possibly think of. And for the entire week, the people that do this are constantly in motion. Like they don't let them stop. It is constant running, constant doing push-ups and sit-ups and chin-ups and whatever else, constantly carrying boats on their heads and running back and forth on the beach for no reason. I mean, the reason is the training. They're carrying logs. They're trying to like float and carry things in the water. They're swimming like crazy. They're rolling in the sand. They're wading in water. They're like up to their necks in sand and getting water going over their faces. Like they're just constantly, like everything about it is the worst thing you can think of. And they're sleep deprived the entire time. They're sleeping like 1 or 2 hours at a time, maybe a couple times a day, so that they get tiny little naps, and then they're woken up, which just ruins your sleep system and like your rhythm, and like everything is just out of whack, and it's horrible. And it's specifically designed to take you to the brink of life, where you feel like you can't make it anymore. And most of the time, they deal with hypothermia. They start hallucinating and seeing things that aren't there and talking to people that aren't there, and they're blacking out constantly for 5.5 days straight, being yelled at, and just like every little bit of it is a stressor. And the idea of it is that it's horrible. Like they want to make it as horrible as it can possibly be, so that when they're in the rest of their life and when they're doing the different missions they're supposed to do, they can be like, at least this isn't that, Like I've been through this before. I know I can make it. I know I can survive. And actually, only 25% of the people that go through this program make it through Hell Week. And they weed out everyone who's not going to make it through the rest of the 56 weeks. So it's just horrible. And the phrase that keeps coming up, the phrase that they use to get people through it, is embrace the suck. It's embrace the things that are just horrible. And it doesn't mean to like enjoy it. It's not like they're like, you should be psychotic and be like, I love the waves crashing over my nostrils. Like that's not what this is supposed to be. But it's embracing the fact that we all know this sucks. This is really hard, but we can press through this and we can make it. Like I know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. There's something good on the other side of this. So this is what NavySeals.com says about people who make it through, because there's like this whole thing on their website where they're like showing what this thing's like. So about the people that make it through, it says, over the years, research has been done to determine a common trait in those individuals who make it through Hell Week without definitive answer. They're not necessarily the largest or strongest men, nor the fastest swimmers, but those with burning desire to be SEALs. So Bud's instructors, the people that lead this, have observed only one true predictor of which candidates will ultimately succeed. It's those who want it the most. You can see it in their eyes. Like literally, it's not the biggest, fastest, strongest, the ones who have all the stuff together. It's just the ones who are like, I will not give up. And I want it the most. And the fact that the only thing that you can see is in their eyes, like a burning passion, like is really interesting. And while exactly 0% of me wants to go through Hell Week, I do think I'd want it said about me that like you can see it in his eyes, he's not going anywhere. He's not stopping, you know? And I think every one of us, I think, should want to have that said about us. Like, there's this narrow path in front of us of following Jesus, and the thing I can say is that you could see it in her eyes. She's not going off of that. You can see it in his eyes that he's going to stick it through and live like Jesus. And I think in order to do that as a Christian and to make it long term, you come to a point where you just have to embrace the suck. Like you really do. Like there's no like fun little picture of a mountain with a psalm on it on Facebook that's going to like get you through the hard times, you know? Like there's no reading plan that goes through the Bible app that you're like, that is what I need. Like sometimes you just need to embrace the suck. And you just need to realize that this is incredibly hard and it's going to take everything in me to make it through. And we're going to look to our left and to our right and realize that 75% of the people we started with are gone. But I'm going to embrace the suck, and I'm going to make it through it, and I'm not going anywhere. Like, you can see it in my eyes. I'm not going anywhere. And I think that's really kind of the sentiment that Peter's giving us here. So let me read that section again. Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude. The same attitude that Christ had just even getting in a body to begin with, embracing the suck, because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. Like when you choose suffering and when you choose to just press through the sin that's coming at you and say, I'm not giving into the flesh, I'm going to embrace the fact that I have this suffering and go after Jesus, that's when you just like stop sinning, you know? Because Jesus, who, yes, is perfect and yes, is God, got hit with all the same temptation that you do, and he didn't give in. So it literally is possible to not sin. Like we can make that choice. And we need to make that choice. Verse 2, as a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. Like, what would it look like if we genuinely just constantly denied our flesh? Like if we constantly said no to that stuff and we embraced the suck of realizing that we're constantly going to be challenged by this thing and we're constantly going to want the stuff that our hearts desire and that our flesh desires, but we can say no to this thing. Like what if we actually denied our flesh and lived like Jesus? Like that would be a really incredible life to live, right? Like that's worth living for. So he digs in deeper here then to the specifics. And I love this. Like he doesn't just say like, oh, sin issues. He like calls people out. Verse 3, for you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. I love it. He just like calls out all the things. You know, he's like, this is what you used to do and what they choose to do now. Don't do it. Like, it's not worth it, you know? Like he calls them out on their past. And like, you know, there's the verse that constantly comes up in my mind. I think it's in Psalms or Proverbs. I really can't remember. But it's talking about how a dog goes back to its vomit is the way that we go back to sin. Like, so a dog pukes and walks away and was like, no, that looked good. And they go back and eat it. You know, that's exactly what it looks like for us to live sin and go right back to it. And he's saying, look, you were in all this stuff and you walked away from it. All of these people that are against you are choosing to do that stuff. Do you really want to go back to that and just like have a buffet? That's disgusting. Yeah, exactly. Like that's what this is supposed to look like. It should make you be a little like pukey, you know, because you're going right back to the same crap. Like, why would we do it? So he lists out this list, and I wanted to say, like, usually when we read verses like this, when we just read through chunks of scripture, we kind of just like look at it like it's a list of bad stuff, and we're just like, yeah, that's gross sex stuff. I'm going to move on, you know? And like, But I think when we define what those things are, we realize that more of it lines up with our culture and with our lives than we think. So I want to look at these things. The first one is debauchery, okay? So debauchery, for all these things, I'll tell you, the way I got the definition is I looked at the actual Greek of what it meant, and then kind of extrapolate from there, what does it look like today? Because when we just hear some of these words, we're like, oh, that means this. But really, the Greek word often is way more encompassing than what we think. So debauchery is a throwing off of sexual restraint, or basically doing whatever you want to do sexually. So this is anything that goes against God's definition of healthy sex. So sleeping around, homosexuality, pornography, even selfishness in sex, like everything that is like sex wrong is involved in this debauchery. Then you've got lust, a passionate longing or craving for someone sexually. And I think this is just as likely to be seen on Instagram as it is in person, maybe more so. And there's a lot of things that a lot of movies that we watch, we're like, oh, it's fine, I'm good on that part. And but there's like a lot of really detestable, lustful stuff that we consume constantly. So that could be Instagram or a romance novel or just lusting after someone in person, like all of it. And then drunkenness. So drunkenness is losing control due to alcohol or another substance. But I want to say, like, drunkenness is not drinking at all. But it is probably a closer definition to what some of us do than we think, Drunkenness is more about losing control and more about losing the ability to make good choices and that kind of thing than it is alcohol in general. And a lot of times we as a culture, Christians, will just write off alcohol, and like we're actually writing off like this section that's fine biblically that Jesus did, but also we're not looking at the fact that other substances match the bad part, So that means being addicted to coffee. Like if you get the shakes because you need coffee in order to operate, like that's not okay. Like that would be under the definition of drunkenness. Getting buzzed and losing the ability to make decisions is the same as being blacked out drunk. Like it's the point, like you shouldn't be doing this. Being addicted to a hard drug, like being completely dependent on really anything is kind of what this is talking about. So then he says to stay away from, in this whole list of things to stay away from, he says orgies. Now that's a pretty obvious one, what that is. And it's always funny, people who haven't read through the Bible yet, who read this and they're like, that's in there? Like that's on the list? But actually, like that was a totally normal thing in Roman culture, as it is a totally normal thing today. Now we look at that like it's kind of an off the beaten path thing, but it's really not. Like there's so many movies and things that portray this as a totally normal thing. But I think also this definition expands a little bit because it's talking about things that happened in Roman culture, and orgies all the time were a part of parties in Rome, and it was like using a party to go somewhere that you shouldn't go, and calling it a festival so it's not a big deal. Like I would never do that normally, but if it's a festival, and I think there's so many things that we do that in today, where we're like, well, because it's culturally acceptable, it's fine, it's this thing. And I think there's so many things that we just like turn a blind eye to because we're like, oh, they're in high school, they'll grow out of that. Like that's like a cultural thing that we're just okay with, and it shouldn't be, or oh, they're just acting. They're not really doing that, but physically they are really doing that, and we see that as not a big deal because culturally it's acceptable. Or you're under mistletoe, you have to kiss. Like there's little things even like that, like where we take these cultural things to an unhealthy level. The next one here is carousing. So that's just partying. Like it's pretty simple. It's losing control in partying, and you can, I think, like if you are a partier, and like you know what I mean by that, like not like backyard barbecue party, but if you're like constantly giving yourself to this stuff, you might not be looking at each little thing you're doing as like sinful, but overall, if your attitude is to let go and completely lose control, like that's the issue he's hitting on here. And then the last thing here is detestable idolatry. And I think we look at that again and we're just like, oh yeah, that's like worshiping an idol. That's wrong. Like, yes, that is wrong. But also like In American culture, most of us are not bowing to a statue of Buddha, but we might be bowing to Taylor Swift, you know? Like, Google Taylor Swift concert, and you will see some of the greatest worship you've ever seen, or the most intense worship you've ever seen, I should say. And I'm not even saying she did anything wrong, or like that's overall a bad thing, but like we as a culture love to worship things that are just not worthy of worship. You know, we love to idolize fame and idolize people in a way that's just unhealthy. So all of these things he lays out as like, this is what you should not do. And again, it's the picture of like, you walked away from that. It's not worth it. You know, don't go back to it. And he's talking to Christians here. I really think if he was talking to non-Christians, this would be a very different story. Like he would say this a little bit differently. And I think he would say it with much less embrace the suck and way more there's so much grace for you. And I think you could say the same to anyone here today too. Like if you're in these things, if you're dealing with these things, then there's so much grace for you. And Jesus didn't come to condemn you of those things and to call you names as you go to hell. He came to free you from those things, to give you freedom, like you're a captive, freedom for the captives from these very things. So if you're addicted to pornography, like he doesn't want to beat you over the head with it and tell you how much of a sinner you are. He wants to help you understand how much of a sinner you are so you have freedom from it. And you can walk away from it. He can give you that freedom. And if you are sleeping around, he wants to give you freedom. And if you're consistently getting drunk, he wants to give you freedom. And if you're constantly scrolling social media every night, just lusting after all the people you're seeing, like he wants to give you freedom from this. And in all of these things, partying or idolizing, whatever it is, like Jesus came to give you freedom. But at the same time, like when you've walked away from those things, don't go back, you know? When you've chosen Jesus, don't go back to that stuff. Don't secretly hide all these things in your life because it's just bringing destruction. Like it's just killing you, right? And he tells us all these things like to stay away from debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and idolatry. And he does that specifically so, let me read this verse again, so we don't live the rest of our earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. Like it's so we don't waste our lives. Yeah. You know? Like I don't know about you, but I see a lot of comfort in that, you know? I think Peter could easily be like, you idiots, what's wrong with you? But he says, guys, don't do this stuff because it's such a waste. Like it's just not worth it. Giving yourself to all these things is just 100% not worth it. And it's so easy to bend on those things and go right back to them just because everybody in culture is saying that they're okay. And everyone's saying that they're normal and that they're right and that you're just exploring your sexuality or whatever the crap it is. Like he's saying it's not worth it. Like, you're literally giving your life up here. And this is what he hits on next about, you know, people accepting us for this stuff. So 1 Peter 4:4. It says, they're surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is the reason the gospel was preached even to those who are now dead, so that they might be judged according to human standards in regard to the body, but live according to God in regard to the spirit. So guys, if you are alive today in America, you will be chastised for living the way that you live. If you were alive 2,000 years ago in Turkey, you would have been chastised for the way that you live. In another 2,000 years, if that exists, you're going to be chastised for, you know, like whatever this is, like you're going to be chastised for living the way that you live. But whether you believe in Jesus or not, you have to give account for the way that you lived your life. And the term here, give account, is actually a legal term that they would have used back then, which basically means to answer for your actions before the final verdict. You know, you're talking to the judge and you're saying, this is why I did what I did. And at the end of the day, we all have this is why I did what I did before Jesus. And Now there's grace for that. Like if you say yes to Jesus, now there's grace and there's mercy and he can erase that sin. But at the end of the day, when the final verdict comes down, you can't be like, but I did this, it's okay. Like you'd be like, no, you missed the point. That I wanted to save you from that. I wanted to walk you away from that. So the point that he's making here is this. He's saying don't give in to that temptation and willingly give yourself over to the world now for enjoyment because it's so small, you know? Like don't give yourself to that stuff because everyone thinks that you're dumb if you don't do it, because saying yes to that is just so small, you know? Like it's just so worthless. Okay, so I want to try something really quick. Raise your hand if you're like more than a few years out of high school. Doesn't matter. A few, 3 years, whatever. There you go. Most of us in this room are a few years out of high school, okay? So who here remembers having a crush on someone in high school? Or, yeah, that was that. I heard that eye roll. I don't know how that worked, but who remembers worrying that a popular person like cared about you or like worried what they thought about you, or who's stressed about being cool? How many of you guys at some point worried about that stuff in high school? Yeah, everybody, right? Like it was do or die. It was life or death for us. Like it was the most important thing. Now raise your hand if you still deeply care about those things from high school. Yeah, no, right? Like no one's like, oh man, like that girl I had a crush on, like unless you're married to that person now, you don't care about what they think of you, you know, or hopefully you don't. Or worrying about the popular people, because most of them are pretty pathetic now anyway. Like that's just kind of how that goes down, you know? Or like stressing about like all the people in school and like how they felt about you. Like it's doubtful that you're on Facebook being like, man, these people from 10 years ago, like I really hope they're seeing all my posts. Like you just don't care anymore, right? Like, and I think most of that is because none of that changed the trajectory of our lives, right? Like the way that our lives were going, none of that was really shifted and altered by those people back then. So I want to break something to you. The coworkers that you work with right now, that you're worried about all those same things, you won't care in the future. You know, the people who are like, oh, you're not going to come out and party? I can't believe you wouldn't do that. Oh, you're not going to do this? Oh, really? Like, we can't have this, you know, friends with benefits thing anymore? Like, oh, you don't want to go do this thing or watch this movie? Like, those people now where it's like soul crushing that they're against you for not doing these things, you won't care. Unless you lead them to Jesus, and then you'll be spurring each other onto that. You know, like that's why you would care. So I think so often we completely press into those people because the now feels like the forever, you know? Like the things that we're dealing with right now feel like we're going to deal with them forever. And there's going to be people who look at you when you're changed and when you're different and are mad at you for not partying with them like you used to, you know, or not getting drunk with them anymore, or, you know, drawing a line of, hey, I don't want to go see that movie because my heart just can't handle that, or that's, you know, for me, I can't do that, or, you know, or I'm not identifying as bisexual because that's cool now if you're younger, or, you know, not using a certain type of social media because it's essentially porn, and people are like, why are you not using this thing? I don't want to, you know, like there's so many of those things where when we draw those lines, people get mad at us for it. And it's funny that like that's literally the same problem that they had then that we have now, and we think it's different. You know? Like how arrogant are we that we're constantly like, yeah, but God, you don't understand American culture. Like it's way better than Roman culture. You know, like at least we like pretend that orgies aren't still a thing. Like they were like, hey, who wants to come to the hangout? Like that's literally like just what it was. And for some reason we draw this line and we're like, yeah, but this is so hard. And there's people who are saying, oh, I should be doing this thing. And ultimately at the end of the day, we need to do the exact same thing that Peter's telling his people to do. Embrace the suck and realize that there's going to constantly be people trying to pull us every direction. And embracing the suck is fighting your flesh and saying, no, I'm not going to do it. And that is what happens when you're sitting in bed and you pull out your phone and you're like, should I scroll Instagram or should I not? Should I open this Snapchat if that's still a thing? I don't know how that was ever a thing, or should I not? Should I, go on TikTok constantly? Should I post this thing? Should I whatever? There's all of these things that are just constantly vying for our attention and constantly telling us if we don't do this, we will be other. And Peter is saying, embrace that and be other. It's not only okay, it's good because you're not wasting your life. And he kind of brings us back to this here, again, reminding us that eternity is near. Because I think when we focus on eternity, it gets us out of the today, It's the same thing as the high school question I asked earlier. That's kind of a joke for most of us. Even the ones who are only a month out of high school, you already know how dumb it was, And I think a few years from now, we're going to look back at the stuff we dealt with today and realize how dumb it was. And imagine that, but extrapolate it out to eternity. When we look at the fact that we have forever in front of us, the stuff today feels like nothing, like literally nothing. So Peter says the same thing, verse 7, the end of all things is near. This is tomorrow, guys. Therefore, be alert and of sober mind so that you may pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sin. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. If anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength that God provides, so that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. To him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. So he draws out this response of what we should do. And at this point, he literally just laid out two options, okay? Option A is debauchery, drunkenness, orgies, idol worship, doing whatever the heck you want, watching pornography, sleeping around, just having friends with benefits, just doing whatever the heck you want to do, being selfish sexually and using your spouse for stuff. All of that is in camp A. Who wants that? Delicious, right? No. Here's the other thing. Don't go back to your vomit. Here's the thing you should be doing. This is what it looks like to love Jesus. This is what it looks like to live for something that's worth it. It's pray, love each other deeply, offer hospitality with a good attitude. They're still partying. It's just different. It's volleyball in a backyard. It's not drunk in an alley. It's way better. Use your gifts, speak godly things over each other, and serve each other with God's strength. It's just a better list. We don't even need to have all the stuff before it where it's embrace the suck and go after the sin, don't go after your sinful stuff, but embrace suffering as we say no to those things. It's just when you have the two options in front of you, it's so obvious which one is better. But for some reason, we still kind of keep coming back to the dark, to the stuff that's just gross. So why do we do all these things? Why do we choose option B instead of option A? So that in all things, God may be praised through Jesus Christ. Because at the end of the day, it's not about you. There's all these good reasons to pick the good, not the bad, but at the end of the day, it's not about you. It's about praising Jesus. It's about giving him the attention he deserves. So when you guys came in, you got a connection card. Do me a favor, pull that out really quick. Or did you guys get one? Oh, look at that. Man, modern. So pull out your phone. And there are some options here on the connection card. If you don't have the connection card on here, or because we don't have the Android app working all the time on all phones, you can just text Caleb. If you want to text Caleb your connection card, if you don't have his number, then go ask him for it. He's right over there. The first thing here is I'll shift my thinking and choose to fight my flesh instead of giving in to sin. Like, that's the embrace the suck. It's deciding to fight your flesh, knowing that you're constantly going to want to go back to your vomit. Number 2 is I'm going to stop putting so much weight on how the world perceives the way I live, because it's so fleeting and it's so temporary. And number 3 is I'll choose prayer, love, hospitality, operating in my gifts, speaking godly encouragement, and serving others this week. Like, those things are a choice. And I'll also say, just as a bonus as we wrap up here, that choosing those things keeps you away from choosing the other. You don't sit in the middle for very long. We choose doing the good stuff, or you eventually choose doing the bad stuff. So let's stand up. As a result of those things, let's worship God, because, at the end of the day, the point of this is to worship God, is to show how good Jesus is. So Lord, that's our prayer for today. God, just keep us away from that stuff. Lord, I pray that you'd even just help us see the areas where we do give ourselves to those things, and we pretend it's not debauchery, but it is. And we pretend it's not the same kind of behavior that the Romans had with their orgies, and it is. And we pretend it's not idol worship, but we can't live without that thing. And we pretend it's not as bad as drunkenness, it's not alcohol, but man, I need this thing to operate, or I love losing control. God, we so often give ourselves to these things. And Lord, I just pray that we would learn to embrace the hardship and just realize that rejecting our flesh isn't going anywhere, and that being a better Christian and looking more like Jesus doesn't make temptation go away. It just helps us see that there's something better. So Lord, I just pray that over all of us today. That we would stop looking for the out, that we'd stop looking for the day where sin isn't something we want, and we would get to the day where you are all we want. Because we're so in love with you, that temptation that's still there is just detestable. God, align our hearts with yours, because our hearts are so broken and are so fleeting. God, help us see the big picture. We love you, Lord. Amen.